Regular pay and overtime pay. Regular pay is calculated by multiplying the hours worked by the pay per hour. In this case, this employee earns $12.40 an hour, and for a 40-hour work week would be paid $496. The $496 is what is considered to be the gross earnings if there were no overtime hours. However, if there were overtime hours, we would calculate overtime pay by one method of multiplying the pay per hour at $12.40. The hours worked are 48. So to determine the overtime rate, we would take the $12.40 per hour, multiply it by 1.5. This would give us $18.60 per hour for overtime pay. Regular pay again is $496. The overtime pay for the 8 hours worked overtime would be $148.80. And the total gross pay would be $644.80. The premium method of calculating overtime pay would be calculated by multiplying the pay per hour times 0.5 to determine that $6.20 per hour is going to be considered the overtime rate. The regular pay is $12.40 multiplied by 48 gives us $595.20. The overtime pay at the 8 hours of overtime is $49.60 for a total gross pay of $644.80. Please note that the regular pay is based off of the 48 hours and the overtime pay is based on the 8 hours of actual overtime. This particular method could potentially save you money on workers' compensation insurance. Now, there's other ways of calculating gross earnings, and that is different rates for different jobs. This particular method, method 1, is calculated by taking job A, $12.40 multiplied by 35 hours worked, gives us $434 for job A. Job B is $226.20, $17.40 times 13 hours. The overtime rate is calculated by multiplying $17.40 by 0.5 to determine that $8.70 per hour is considered to be the overtime rate. Overtime pay, $69.60. And total gross pay is $729.80. Method 1 bases overtime rate on the highest paying job the employee worked on. Different rates for different jobs. Method 2. Job A has regular pay of $434. Job B, regular pay is $226.20. For total regular pay of $660.20. Overtime rate is calculated by taking the regular rate, dividing by 48, and multiplying by 0.5 to determine that $6.86 is the overtime rate per hour. Overtime pay is multiplied by 8 times 6.86 to determine that $54.88 is the overtime pay, to give us a total gross pay of $715.08. Method 2 bases overtime on regular pay averaged by the hours worked and multiplied by 0.5. Different rates for different jobs. Method 3. Job A's regular pay is $434. Job B's regular pay is $226.20 for total regular pay of $660.20. Overtime pay, 8 times 8.70 is $69.60 for a total gross pay of $729.80. Method 3 bases the overtime pay rate on Job B because Job B is the job the employee went into overtime hours on. Converting salary to hourly rates. To convert weekly salary to hourly rates, we will take the weekly salary, $515, divide by 40 hours. That gives us $12.88 per hour. The overtime wage rate would be calculated by taking the hourly wage rate of $12.88, multiplying by 1.5 to give us $19.32 per hour for overtime wage rate. Regular pay is $515. The overtime pay is $154.56, giving us a gross pay of $669.56. To convert biweekly salary to hourly rates, we will make the biweekly salary $1,115 divided by 2 gives us $557.50 for a weekly wage. Hourly wage rate is $13.94. That is taking the $557.50 and dividing by 40. The overtime wage rate is calculated by taking the hourly wage rate of $13.94 multiplying by 1.5 to give us $20.91 as overtime wage rate. The regular pay, $1,115. Overtime pay, $167.28. For total gross pay of $1,282.28. To convert monthly salary to hourly rates, we will need to annualize the monthly salary of $2,231 multiplied by 12 gives us an annual salary of $26,772. We will then determine the weekly salary by dividing by 52. That gives us $514.85. We will then determine the hourly rate divided by 40 gives us $12.87 per hour. To determine the overtime rate, we take the $12.87 multiplied by 1.5 to give us 19.31 cents per hour for overtime. The regular pay, $514 and 8.46. Overtime pay, $154.48 for a total gross pay of $669.36. Converting my bi-monthly salary to hourly rates, we will then annualize the bi-monthly salary by multiplying by 24. This gives us $26,760. We will determine the weekly salary by dividing by 52. Gives us $514.62. To determine the hourly rate, we divide by 40. This gives us $12.87 per hour. And to determine the overtime rate, we take the $12.87 multiplied by 1.5 to give us $19.31 for overtime rate. Regular pay, $514.615. Overtime pay, $154.48 for a total gross pay of $669.10. Converting annual salary to hourly rates, we will need to determine what the weekly salary is, so we will divide by 52 to determine that $19,961.54 is the weekly salary. Determine the hourly rate divided by 40 gives us $24.04 per hour. Determine the overtime rate by multiplying by 1.5. That gives us $36.06 for overtime. Regular pay, $961.538. Overtime pay, $288.48, for a total gross pay of $1,250.02. Tipped employees, the meat and potatoes of paying tipped employees. Susie Joe Q works at the Lean and Mean Steakhouse as a server, and she earns $2.13 an hour for a 40-hour work week. She received $150 in tips for the week. Let's compute her wages to determine if her employer should pay her more wages to meet the minimum wage standard. $2.13 times 40 hours a week equals $85.20, plus her tips of $150 equals total pay of $235.20. The $235.20 pay does not equal the federal minimum wage and thus requires the employer to make up the difference. So how much more does Susie Joe Q's employer owe her? Minimum wage at $7.25 an hour for a 40-hour work week is $290. Susie Joe Q earned $235.20. Thus, her employer owes her an additional amount of $54.80. Susie Joe Q works at the Lean and Mean Steakhouse as a server, and she earns $85.20 for a 40-hour work week. She received $80 in tips for the week. So how much does Susie's employer pay her per hour? If you said B, you're correct. Her employer pays her $2.13 an hour. $85.20 divided by 40 equals $2.13. The tips do not count towards wages from the employer when determining the pay per hour. Piece rate system and special incentive plan. Susie Q produced 14,000 items during a 40-hour work week. Susie is paid 6 cents per item and earns a bonus of 3 cents per item over 13,000 a week. How much does Susie Q get paid for the week? Let's calculate her regular earnings. Regular earnings would be the 14,000 units multiplied by the 6 cents equals $840. Her bonus earnings are going to be calculated at 1,000 units times 3 cents to provide a total weekly earnings of $870. What is her hourly wage? $870 divided by 40 equals $21.75 per hour. Piece rate system overtime method A. Susie Q produced 14,000 items during a 44-hour work week. Susie is paid 6 cents per item. How much does Susie Q get paid for the week? Her regular earnings are going to be calculated at 14,000 units times 6 cents for $840. Her regular rate is the $840 divided by 44 equals $19.10 per hour. The overtime rate will be calculated by taking the $19.10 per hour multiplying by 0.5 to give us $9.55. The overtime earnings are calculated with the 4 hours multiplied by $9.55 equals $38.20 for total earnings of $878.20. Piece rate system overtime method B. Susie Q's produced 14,000 items during a 44-hour work week. Susie's paid 6 cents and 9 cents per items produced during the overtime hours. Of the 14,000 units produced, 4,000 were produced during overtime hours. How much does Susie Q get paid for the week? Her regular earnings are the 10,000 units multiplied by 6 cents for $600. The overtime is 4,000 units times 9 cents for $360 for total regular and overtime earnings of $960. Piece rate system checkpoint. Let's try one. Joe Smith is paid 15 cents per unit produced. During a week, Joe worked 45 hours and produced 5,000 units. Compute the following. The piece work earnings is going to be 5,000 units times 15 cents for $750. The regular hourly rate is calculated by dividing $750 by 45 hours to give us $16.67. The overtime hourly rate is calculated by taking the $16.67 multiplying by 0.5 to determine the overtime hourly rate is $8.34. The overtime earnings are calculated by taking the 5 hours of overtime multiplied by 834 equals 4170 overtime earnings. And the total earnings are calculated by adding the regular earnings to the overtime earnings for a total of $791.70. The Piece Rate Incentive Plan. Marshall Mathers is paid based on the following Piece Rate Incentive Plan. If he produces less than 2,000 bumpers, he is paid .016 per bumper. For bumpers produced of 2001 to 2,199, he's paid .0175. 2,200 bumpers, which is considered to be the daily standard, he is paid .018. For 2,201 to 2,300 bumpers produced, he is paid .09195. For 2,301 to 2,450 bumpers produced, he is paid .0205. And for any bumpers over 2,450, he is paid .035 per bumper. Depending on the number of units produced depends on the earnings. This plan provides an incentive to employees to work harder and faster without compromising quality.